Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here this morning. This is a very important topic to the dairy industry as well as many other sectors of the U.S. economy. Before I get started, I'll give you a little bit more context for Leprino Foods Company. We're the world's largest mozzarella manufacturer. Many folks don't know us because we don't sell under our own label at retail. However, we do have the 10 plants in the U.S., and we are the largest supplier to the pizza industry, exclusive supplier to Pizza Hut, Domino's, Papa John's, as well as a number of the other pizza companies that not only have a very strong domestic presence, but also have expanded worldwide over the last several decades. So we're keenly interested in global trade opportunities. I'm also the chair of U.S. Dairy Export Council's Trade Policy Committee, and so my comments today will be on behalf of the broader dairy industry, in addition to some context from within the company. The U.S. dairy industry does support the U.S. EU trade and investment partnership negotiations. We expect these negotiations to be comprehensive in that they will remove the many tariff and non-tariff barriers that hinder U.S. dairy market access to into the EU. Before I talk about the specifics of the TTIP agreement, let's look at the trade picture, which underscores the unlevel playing field for U.S. dairy in the EU market. Our dairy market has been relatively open to EU dairy exports, as evidenced by the $1.3 billion sold here last year. In contrast, U.S. dairy exports to the EU were only $88 million, less than the U.S. sold to either Australia or New Zealand, both major dairy exporting nations and not typically strong destinations for U.S. dairy exports or U.S. dairy products. Many people rationalize that this disparity in trade flows is related to the prevalence of artisan cheeses coming in from Europe. I would suggest that there's a much broader issue here as reflected by the Leprino experience. Back in the 1980s, many of our U.S.-based customers were expanding into Europe, the pizza chains in particular, and invited us to supply them in the European market. In the context of the trade barriers that existed at that point, it was very difficult for us to do so, and so we explored the opportunity to provide or to establish a European production base, and actually we're very close to investing in the European market with plant assets in the early 90s. As the Uruguay round of the WTO came close to implementation, though, we were given some hope that we would be able to access that market from the U.S. In fact, there is a tariff code that is specified in a way where very few companies at that time could achieve those specifications. And so we were quite excited about the opportunity to access the European market from the U.S. However, after that implementation, we found that it still was not a practical opportunity. Although there were significant volumes of cheese that we could have sold into Europe, the Import License Administration made it very difficult to assemble commercially viable quantities because those import licenses were spread over a great number of people. And again, relative to the quantities that our customers would need in Europe, in some of those early years after the Uruguay round implementation, in fact, there were times when it was difficult to even find a single buyer with more than a container load of access to those import licenses. And so this disparity cannot be rationalized by the product that is produced in the different economies. It really is related to many, not only tariff barriers, but the non-tariff barriers that currently exist. The U.S. is a major dairy exporter with global exports of $5.2 billion in 2012, so our lack of trade with the EU is clearly not due to the U.S. being a minor player in global dairy markets. Rather, it reflects the high degree of barriers facing our products' entry to that market. We believe that TTIP offers a genuine opportunity to expand U.S. dairy exports and chip away at the sizable dairy trade deficit with the EU. So what is a comprehensive agreement? In our view, the TTIP must address the following elements: tariffs and tariff administration, export subsidies, non-tariff barriers, which include regulatory barriers and restrictions against the use of common food names. And I'll go over each of these in greater detail. First is the critical issue of tariffs. Provided that TTIP truly removes the non-tariff barriers hindering U.S. dairy access to the EU markets, we support full tariff elimination. Achievement of both these elements in tandem is critical, since regulatory barriers can still block product very effectively, even in a zero tariff situation. Since EU dairy tariffs are on average 3 times those of the U.S., their removal must be handled in a coordinated manner that reflects this disparity. While tariffs are in the process of being phased out, tariff administration measures are very important. The existing procedures in the EU are extremely complex and burdensome. They must be streamlined to improve trading conditions while tariffs are being eliminated. Areas of concern include import licensing and TRQ administration, variable levies, and port inspection issues. TTIP offers an excellent opportunity to finally eliminate U.S. and EU export subsidies. When in use, the EU's massive export subsidy allowances can tremendously distort world dairy markets. The EU can spend over 2 billion euros on dairy export subsidies, as seen in this chart. In past FTAs, the U.S. has typically prohibited the bilateral use of export subsidies. TTIP should go just one step further and fully eliminate direct export subsidies to all destinations. A key outcome of these negotiations for the U.S. dairy industry is to ensure that our products have access to the EU market without unwarranted burdens. Unfortunately, this is currently not the case. We believe that our system provides the level of food safety required by the EU, yet the U.S. faces many regulatory barriers and the threat of future trade restrictions. Examples of concern include current issues such as those related to semantic cell count requirements and other burdensome export certificate challenges, as well as emerging ones such as cloned animal regulations that appear out of alignment with the science on the related risk of this type of new technology. Given these many hurdles, we believe the appropriate focus must be on a broad recognition of the strength of the U.S. regulatory system for dairy products in order to remove these various impediments. As in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, we expect TTIP to include strong rules on sanitary and phytosanitary measures that build upon the WTO SPS agreement in an enforceable manner. Other issues such as regulatory or geographical indications and the use of common food names are also a high priority for the U.S. dairy industry, given the present barriers we face in this arena in the EU market and the increasing number of barriers we are beginning to see pop up in other markets around the world as a result of those countries' trade negotiations with the EU. Craig Thorne will address this issue in greater detail, but let me just say that the U.S. dairy industry welcomes a separate bilateral discussion on GIs to address the legitimate concerns of both sides, particularly access to the EU market and elsewhere for products using common food names such as Parmesan and feta. We strongly reject any suggestion, however, that the U.S. should relinquish the right to use long-standing generic food names as part of that process. It is inconceivable that an FTA would impose new restrictions on competition and block accurately labeled products from markets, but that seems to be an approach that the EU has pursued with other countries in this area. In our view, an outcome that results in new restrictions on U.S. companies and limits competition would be entirely inconsistent with the overarching TTIP goal of liberalizing transatlantic trade. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.